Hey, you guys remember emo? Yeah, what was up with that? I mean, first of all, what even was emo? If you look up emo on Wikipedia, it'll tell you that it was an offshoot of the 1990s DC hardcore punk scene emphasizing emotional expression in music. This is a piece of cardboard. I'm recording this on it. Never mind. But that is true. Emotional hardcore got shortened to emo-core and then eventually just emo. But I don't think that's what most people today are thinking of when they hear the word emo. You might also be thinking about Midwest emo. Midwest emo is a pretty legit and self-contained genre that originated from the same real emo scene of the 90s, but quickly diverged away from hardcore and began to meld with indie and math rock. Got a lot less angry and more depressed and a lot nerdier, with a lot of very technical arpeggiated guitars and soft vocals. It's basically any album with the house on the cover. Midwest emo is pretty cool and it's still going strong today, and it even has emo in the name. But it's probably also not really what you imagine when you hear someone say emo. What you probably had in mind was what some people might call mall emo, so called because it was mostly propagated by teenagers in Midwest suburbia hanging out in malls in the mid to late 2000s. Kids who looked like this or this and listened to bands like My Chemical Romance, Fall Out Boy, Panic at the Disco, and Paramore. Mall emo was, I guess, a social and artistic movement, although calling it that is a little grandiose. In reality, it was mostly a lot of teenagers and kids experimenting with their own music and fashion tastes for the first time. A lot of people would call emo a musical genre, but finding any kind of coherent definition for what that genre actually was is a little tricky. A lot of bands that were called emo were, musically speaking, from one of a number of different subgenres, mostly pop punk and post-hardcore, but also nu metal, pop and pop rock, metalcore, punk, and even new goth, or whatever Evanescence was. Also, most of the core bands of the scene renounced the emo label, maybe to distance themselves from the negative image of the scene in the early days, or maybe because they just felt it didn't describe them very well. The only thing that really united the emo cohort musically was an emphasis on emotional expression, especially negative emotions like sadness, frustration, and self-loathing, under the general umbrella of alt-rock. Really, emo music was just whatever music emo kids liked. So who were these emo kids? That's what the video's about. I hope that sounds like a fun video, because that's what we're going to be talking about for the next hour. Now, this might be a long video, so I want to give you a little bit of a roadmap up front of where we're going. This is going to be a classic 3-part video in the sense that it has 6 parts, but only 3 of them have numbers, so we're calling it a 3-parter. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about emo music, specifically in the context of exploring some of the history and genealogy of alternative music in the 2000s. Then we're going to talk a little bit about emo aesthetic, and I'm mostly going to try to use this time to differentiate between emo and competing subcultures like scene and goth. Lastly, I want to take a little time to explore the culture, psychology, and politics of emo. And I'll be honest, I buried the lead on this one a little bit. I kind of think this is the most interesting part. So if you just couldn't give a single fuck about music or fashion, you can just skip ahead to this part. But I hope you'll watch the whole video, because I put a lot of work into it and I think it's really interesting, and I think you might think so too. Then I'll wrap up with a little epilogue about the legacy and future of emo. Before we get started, you might be wondering what my stake in all this is. Why am I qualified to be talking about this, and why do I even care? Today, in the year of our Lord 2021, I'm 24 years old, which means that I was 13 in 2010. So I'm at an age where I remember this stuff. I lived through it, but I was also a little too young to ever really be involved. I mean, don't get me wrong. I had peers and classmates who were all in on the emo thing, even in like 2012. But even at that age, I think I could sense that this phenomenon was on its way out. At the time, I definitely had too much self-respect, or maybe just not enough confidence to engage in any of that culture directly or admit that I listened to the music, but I was definitely aware of it, and it was always kind of alluring to me. Now, as an adult, I'm rediscovering a lot of the music that I passed over the first time. I found an unironic love of artists like Paramore and Avril Lavigne, who I would have dismissed as girly or uncool as a 14-year-old. I've developed a bit of anemoia for emo, and I want to talk about it. So I felt like I had enough general knowledge and lived experience to just fire a video like this off the cuff, but I really wanted to come correct, so I did a lot of research for this video. For pretty much every musical artist I mentioned, I listened to their complete discography to make sure I was characterizing them correctly. I listened all the way through Stand Up and Scream 3 times to decide if I was justified in making one offhand comment about it that I ended up cutting from the video. I spent a lot of time on the Wayback Machine archives of the emo tag on Tumblr, looked at some old MySpace profile screenshots, crawled through the back alleys of some abandoned emo forums, watched a lot of utterly nonsensical YouTube videos made by 15-year-olds in 2007, and read a lot of academic writing on the subject that has compiled over the last 15 years. So everything I say here might not be totally correct, but know that I'm not just saying it for no reason. So if you also lived through this period, I hope this can be a bit of fun nostalgia for you, and maybe make you think about one or two things that you missed the first time around. And if you're too young or too old to remember emo, or if you just weren't paying attention 15 years ago, I hope this can serve as a relatively accessible introduction to the idea, and maybe point you down the same path of rediscovery that I've been on lately. So with all that said, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. First things first, we should probably talk about the music, because whether or not emo really was a genre in its own right, music was very important to the culture. And I think most emo kids at the time would have pointed to music taste as a defining attribute in what it meant to be emo. I've already mentioned what I consider to be the big 4 bands of emo, but I think it's worthwhile to go back and have a little bit of a history lesson so that we can better understand the landscape of alternative music at the time, how it got that way, and how it changed over the course of the emo period. Once upon a time, there was rock music. Then, sometime around the early 70s, there was a bit of a schism, and 2 huge new subgenres broke away from the rock family tree: metal and punk. A surprising amount of blog posts that I read online researching for this claimed that emo was a metal subgenre, which is just flat out false, except maybe in a very tangential way. But it is worth taking a few seconds to look at where metal went, because it does come back into play later. Metal started to get popular in the 70s with bands like Black Sabbath, Iron Maiden, and Judas Priest. It sounded like, well, you know what it sounded like. It sounded like metal. A lot of wailing guitar solos, big drums, and melodramatic vocals with lyrics about, like, demons and wizards. Actually, the shocking thing listening to old heavy metal today is just how not heavy it is and how much it kind of just sounds like rock. After that initial heavy metal scene, though, the next 40 years of metal basically became an arms race to be the heaviest, the loudest, and the most brutal. Things started to get serious in the 80s with thrash metal, and then we ended up in the 90s with death metal, black metal, and grindcore. By the 2000s, we had things like slam that were really pushing the limits of what could be considered musical. With basically nowhere left to go in the heavy direction, metal bands started to diverge into more interesting directions, and we got subgenres like groove metal, gent, and nu metal. Nu metal, and especially Linkin Park, who were more on the rock side of nu metal, weren't really part of the core emo scene, but they were definitely floating in the same waters. I can guarantee that there were a lot of young kids who self-identified as emo in 2007 who had Hybrid Theory on their iPod Nanos. So that's metal. Punk has a much more direct relationship to the music that we came to call emo. The early punk sound was pioneered in the 70s by bands like Buzzcocks, Ramones, The Clash, and the Sex Pistols. It was a direct response to the very sanitized and frankly boring mainstream rock of the 60s and 70s. The punk sound was very raw and angry and often just deliberately bad. Although, as with early metal, I think it sounds surprisingly tame to a modern audience.
Don't know what I want, but I know how to get it. I wanna destroy, possibly, 'cause I wanna be.
Culturally, punk was pretty much what you imagine. The aesthetic was to look like a post-apocalyptic road warrior, and the ethos was very anti-establishment and DIY. Not too long after the punk scene started, it also fractured into a number of subgenres. On the one hand, you had post-punk. Post-punk kept punk's DIY ethos, but slowed things down a little bit, taking influence from jazz, funk, and even disco. It was a very artsy genre. You had bands like Joy Division, Bauhaus, Gang of Four, The Talking Heads, and Susie and the Banshees.
Lines in the rain, special effects by lunatic and drinks, the graveyard scene.
Post-punk didn't directly feed into emo, but it did feed into goth, which was definitely an adjacent movement. We'll talk about goth more later. On the other hand, you had hardcore, which went in the opposite direction. Hardcore took punk to its logical conclusion by being even faster, heavier, and more aggressive. Hardcore came up in the east and west coasts of the United States, led by bands like Black Flag and the Dead Kennedys. We'll get back to hardcore in a little bit. The last big punk spin-off that is relevant here is pop punk, which would go on to be one of the core pillars of the emo sound. As the name suggests, pop punk kept the high energy of punk, but smoothed it out and made it more accessible by blending it with aspects of pop. Pinning down exactly where pop punk started is a little tricky. Like, were the Ramones pop punk? Were the Buzzcocks? Yes, I mean, yeah, they were. But they don't sound like the pop punk that we know today. In my opinion, the first album that really sounded like our modern idea of pop punk was Milo Goes to College by the Descendants in 1982.
When it comes home, your bed is on and I'll be gone. But I know my day will come. I know someday I'll be the only one.
Milo Goes to College is a great album that I think still holds up, but it wasn't cool. I mean, I think it was pretty cool, but it wasn't mainstream. Pop punk was a tiny niche in an already small subculture of punk, at least until...
Here we go again, infatuation, judges, they judge when I thought.
Green Day was pretty much a hit from when they first started in the 80s, but they really blew up with Dookie in 94, and they really blew up with American Idiot in 2004. And here's my hot take. I don't really think Green Day was a pop punk band, at least not in the beginning. I kind of think they were just punk. I think they were just more accessible to a wide audience because they were, frankly, just kind of better than a lot of their contemporary punk bands. They had very credible roots in the 924 Gilman scene, and I don't know, their early music just doesn't really sound that poppy to me.
It all keeps adding up. I think I'm cracking up. Am I just paranoid? Am I just up?
I think the only really non-punk thing they did was to be commercially successful, and boy were they. They catapulted punk and pop punk into the mainstream, and along with a few other bands like The Offspring, exposed a whole generation to that sound. Pop punk was now popular with the mainstream, and a bunch of suburban kids who would have never been part of the underground scene were now making pop punk bands. And when those bands got successful, they looked like Blink-182. If Green Day was more on the punk side of pop punk, Blink was more on the pop side, and they were, if anything, even more successful. From about 99 to 04, not just alternative music, but mainstream culture was absolutely dominated by Blink and Blink clones. The big three here would be Blink-182, Sum 41, and Newfound Glory, but there were just a litany of bands that sounded almost exactly the same. A lot of these bands were pretty good in their own right, but I think it's fair to group them all as Blink clones here because the sound was so homogenous. I think part of the success of the Blink cohort can be attributed to being so accessible to mainstream America. Almost all the hard edge of Green Day and the skate punk bands of the 90s is gone. Blink were just a bunch of good suburban boys who were maybe a little juvenile and crass, but definitely not threatening. It's also worth noting how racially diverse the scene was. No, I'm just kidding. It was incredibly white. Basically, all of the genres I've mentioned were primarily driven by white artists, but Blink and the Blink era was aggressively, overwhelmingly the music of white suburbia. When people talk about like white people music, this is it. They're talking about Blink. To be clear, I don't think this is inherently a problem. I don't think Blink was racist. I think they were just making music for themselves and not really thinking about cultivating any kind of an audience in particular. But I still think it's worth keeping in mind. The Blink era audience and everything before it was also overwhelmingly male. There were a lot of lyrics that were basically teenage boy humor, and in retrospect would probably have been pretty off-putting to anyone outside of that demographic. But the next generation of pop punk brought in a huge female audience, and I think contemporary pop punk has become one of the most diverse alt-rock genres in terms of both artists and fans. So what did come after Blink? Starting around 2003, we got the first hints of what would become the emo era in pop punk. Maybe it's just selection bias on my part, but I feel like this era was one of the most musically diverse periods in pop punk. I feel like there was less of the orthodox sound of the Blink days or what would come later, and more of just a bunch of bands doing their own thing. Most of these bands took that Blinky sound and made it a little less bombastic and less juvenile, I guess, maybe more juvenile. The attitude of the music definitely transitioned from like, girls are hot and farts are funny, I love suburbia, to my life is so hard and my parents could never understand. So it's up to you if that was aging up or down. This is the era when a lot of the classic emo bands got their start. Fall Out Boy and Panic at the Disco both put out huge breakout albums in 2005, which catapulted them to the top of the Billboard charts.
I chime in with a haven't you people ever heard of? Dance, dance, we're falling apart to halftime. Dance, dance.
Green Day released American Idiot in '04, which saw the band adopting a much more emo aesthetic, and a few of the more melodic songs off of that album got some heavy rotation in the emo scene.
I walk a lonely road, the only one that I have ever known.
Paramore was also active in this era, with their first big hit coming right at the end of this period with Riot in 2007. A lot of people would consider this '04 to '07 era peak emo. Personally, when I think of emo, I tend to think more of the '08 to 2012 era. Maybe this is just personal bias because as someone on the younger side of that age range, this is the era that I remember living through. I also think in a lot of places, it just took trends a little while to catch up. Even if the music most people were listening to was mostly from 2005, a lot of the local scenes didn't fully develop the cohesive aesthetic and culture until like '09. Google Trends shows searches for emo peaking in 2007 and holding pretty steady through 2010 before taking a pretty sharp decline in 2012. A lot of these emo era pop punk bands continued putting out albums into the 2010s and had a lot of success. But the biggest sound in pop punk from 2008 onward wasn't emo. It was something new.
'Cause I got your picture coming with you, dear Maria, count me in. There's a story at the bottom of this bottle and I'm the pen.
In 2007, All Time Low put out So Wrong It's Right with the hit single Dear Maria Count Me In, and pretty much set the template for what would become neon pop punk. Neon was a more upbeat, even poppier version of the Blink-182 sound, updated with some electronic influence, more synthesizers, pianos, and even some stylistic auto-tune. It seemed like pretty much overnight there were 1,000 boy bands that looked and sounded exactly like All Time Low. Bands like Boys Like Girls, We the Kings, Hey Monday, Forever the Sickest Kids, The Ready Set, We Are the In Crowd, Cute Is What We Aim For. The list goes on. A lot of these bands weren't exactly one-hit wonders. They had a small diehard fan base and were part of a healthy touring ecosystem, but most of them only really had one breakout hit single, All Time Low being the exception. I think it's debatable how much neon pop punk overlapped with emo culture. They were definitely happening at the same time and in the same places, and there was some musical overlap, but for the most part, the most orthodox neon pop punk bands were too upbeat, too party oriented, and honestly just too happy to be fully enmeshed in the emo scene. But of course, that's not to say that there weren't thousands of young girls who had emo in their MySpace bio and All Time Low songs on their playlist. Personally, I really like a lot of this stuff, but I feel like objectively I have to admit most of it hasn't aged particularly well, especially the more electro pop stuff. The good news is that neon quickly matured over the 2010s into something a lot more palatable. This is more or less where we depart from emo culture, but for the sake of completeness, I'll try to quickly bring us up to date with the present day. The neon bubble burst in the early 2010s, and pop punk in general wasn't really that popular for a little while. From 2010 to 2015, there was a brief flare of popularity on Tumblr where you got the sad boy pop punk bands like The Story So Far. This stuff was a more mature adult take on pop punk with a more indie aesthetic. The sound had some hardcore and grunge influence, and honestly harkened all the way back to something like The Descendants, at least to my ears. Some of these bands did pretty well, but even at the time, to me, it always had the feeling of a fringe genre that was on its way out. I mean, you don't make defend pop punk shirts if you think your genre is growing. Then around 2016, we got what I'm calling post-neon or maybe neo-neon pop punk. That would be bands like Stand Atlantic, Water Parks, With Confidence, and Between You and Me. Basically, I just think of this as the Hopeless Records sound. These guys mellowed out a lot of the sound of the early neon days and made it into something a little bit more mature and respectable. This stuff is definitely the least popular subgenre I've mentioned so far, but it's also by far my favorite. It's basically just All Time Low for grown-ups. Although you could probably actually just put All Time Low here again too, because they really were that influential and they kept switching up their sound as time went on. This brings us to 2020 and the pop punk revival. This wave is being led by artists like MGK, Mod Sun, Youngblood, and Jaden. A lot of the sound reaches all the way back to the Blink days for inspiration. Most of it is actually produced, featured on, and or generally endorsed by Travis Barker or Avril Lavigne, who are really spearheading the return of that older sound. There's also some fresh new takes though, including some influence from hip hop. A lot of the leading artists of this genre are solo acts who used to be branded as rappers, but have morphed into making more pop punk style music. There's also a huge explosion of young new bands today that I'm very excited about, like Kenny Hoopla, Meet Me at the Altar, Lil Lotus, and Hot Milk. So that's basically the state of pop punk and how things looked in the emo era. I said earlier that pop punk is one of the core pillars of the emo sound, but for the other, we'll have to go back to the top and talk about hardcore. Don't worry, this one will go a lot faster. As I mentioned in the beginning, in the 90s in hardcore, you have the real emo movement with bands like Fugazi and Rites of Spring. For me, though, things get interesting in the 2000s when hardcore splits and we get some of the post-hardcore genres. On the one hand, you get metalcore, which is a fusion genre that combines the screaming and high intensity of hardcore with metal riffs and breakdowns. Depending on who you ask, metalcore goes as far back as the 80s, but the flavor that we know today really started in the later 2000s. I know they weren't the first, but to my mind, if you want to get a good look at the overall landscape of metalcore with just one band, I think you have to look at Bring Me the Horizon. Bring Me the Horizon evolved their sound a lot over the course of the 2000s, pretty much always staying just ahead of the curve of what metalcore sounded like. Their first album, Count Your Blessings, was a foray into the subgenre of deathcore, which combined hardcore with the especially heavy flavor of death metal. It sounded like this. Their next album mellowed out their sound a little bit and went in a more mainstream metalcore direction. In particular, they pulled a lot of nu metal influence for the metal part of metalcore, which was becoming more popular at the time, as opposed to something like thrash or melodeath, or even all the way back to something like Black Sabbath that some bands were doing. Then in the 2010s, they brought in a more radio rock influence and eventually became more or less just a rock band, which is a direction that a lot of the early metalcore bands would end up going in the 2010s. Their biggest hit, Can You Feel My Heart, is the one that's in all those TikTok memes.
Can you fix the broken? Can you feel the
So that's what metalcore is doing. How does it relate to emo? In terms of musical genre, metalcore is a little outside the range of what most people would consider emo. If anything, I think it was more popular in scene culture. Don't worry, we'll get to the age-old emo versus scene debate in a little bit. Stylistically and thematically, though, there was a lot of crossover. A lot of the later 2010s metalcore bands like Of Mice and Men, Asking Alexandria, Bless the Fall, Crown the Empire, and Sleeping with Sirens definitely had a emo-inspired aesthetic with the emo hair, beanies, and all-black clothes. A lot of the lyrical content of this 2000s metalcore was pretty emotional too, and honestly not that different from like Red Jumpsuit Apparatus lyrics, or at least that's what I imagine. I can never understand the lyrics anyway. If you look online, you'll even find a bunch of articles from metal nerds complaining about how metalcore was ruined by going emo. So I don't know, maybe it wasn't true emo, but I think metalcore has to be in the discussion when you're talking about emo's overall musical landscape. Metalcore wasn't fully embraced by emo, but post-hardcore definitely was. I mean, I guess you could call metalcore post-hardcore because it came after hardcore, but I'm specifically talking here about screamo. For me, this sound was really cemented by Seosin in 2003 with their Translating the Name EP. The sound alternated relatively gentle alt-rock with a lot of twinkly guitars and sad, clean vocals, punctuated by screaming choruses and occasional blasts of heavy guitar. There were other bands like Under Oath who were coming out around the same time or even earlier with a similar sound, but it seems like after Translating the Name, there was an absolute gold rush of local bands trying to sound exactly like Seosin. There was actually a pretty big movement around this stuff in the early 2000s. Some people would call it the mall screamo era, which then bled into the mall emo era of the later 2000s and early 2010s. You got bands like Hawthorne Heights, which is in my mind a quintessential emo band, but had that very distinctive post-hardcore sound.
slow things down or speed them up? Not enough or way too much? How are you in a gun? I can't make it on my own.
So if you take the screaming out of screamo, you get just emo, I guess. This would have been bands like The Used and Taking Back Sunday in the early 2000s. If you had to put My Chemical Romance anywhere on this map, they would probably go here. A lot of these bands worked in some rock and even indie influences, looking at you, Dashboard Confessional. I think it's up for debate if this just emo genre evolved from screamo, or if it evolved in parallel from the real emo of the 90s, or if it's really all just one genre of post-hardcore that I'm arbitrarily dividing here based on how heavy the vocals were. But if you want to get a good idea of what this stuff sounded like, I would actually listen to Matt Cutshall's song, A Letter to Ashley. This song was written as a kind of parody or pastiche of emo music, and it's deliberately a little silly, but it's also genuinely really good, and I think it perfectly summarizes both the audio and visual aesthetic of that time. So that's emo. If you want to define it as its own musical genre, it's probably just that very narrow cluster of mellowed out post-hardcore bands. But if you want to define it as just the music of the emo movement, then it's all of it. From Blink-182 to All Time Low to Asking Alexandria to Linkin Park to Seosin. Plus stuff I didn't even talk about. I've heard indie bands like Modest Mouse and Death Cab for Cutie called emo, rock bands like Breaking Benjamin, and pop acts like Avril Lavigne. The truth is that even though we can retroactively construct these complex genealogies of genre, most teenagers in 2008 weren't thinking about this stuff. To most lay people at the time, and honestly even to most people who self-identified as emo music was just any alternative guitar music with relatively sad or thoughtful lyrics. So I guess I could have saved a lot of time and just said that. Emo wasn't just a genre, it was also an aesthetic. Emo kids didn't just have opinions about music, they also had very strong opinions about fashion and self-expression. The fashion of emo lived in close proximity with, and often in juxtaposition to, the two main competing subcultures, goth and scene, as well as the remnants of grunge, punk, and metal aesthetics that were still kind of kicking around in the 2000s. Distinguishing between these subcultures, especially when it comes to aesthetics, is very tricky. At the time, a lot of people used them interchangeably. I think in the 2000s, I would have called any girl with dark hair and a lot of eyeliner emo or goth interchangeably, and not really thought any more of it. However, and perhaps because of this, there were also people who were extremely passionate about the differences between these groups. A lot of young kids in the 2000s would have been incredibly offended if you called them scene when they were emo or vice versa. So in fairness to these kids of 10 years ago, I'm actually going to try and do my best to tease out some of the differences here. I did a lot of research for this section. Emo is kind of unique in that it was one of the first cultural movements to happen predominantly online. Peak emo was happening right around the time when a lot of kids were beginning to live persistently on the internet in a way that only extreme nerds really had before. Early social media like MySpace and later Tumblr, as well as just a litany of forums and blogs, were becoming a breeding ground for alternative culture in a way that hadn't really been the case before. Sadly, a lot of this content has been lost since then, but a lot has also survived. Pro tip for early internet historians, you can put before : and a date in Google search and it will only show pages indexed before that date. So I was able to read a lot of primary sources, so to speak. And after reading all these sources, I came away with two conclusions. One, most of these people really were kids, or at least had the typing and grammatical skills of someone in 5th grade English. And two, no one agreed about anything, especially when it came to delineating the boundaries of the movement, especially when it came to fashion and aesthetics. There's a lot of incoherent, self-contradictory, borderline simply incorrect information out there. On the one hand, it's tempting to dismiss this stuff as just what some sheltered 12-year-old imagined the culture to be. But on the other hand, what really is the culture except the collective imagination of a bunch of ill-informed 12-year-olds? With all that being said, here's what I was able to say relatively confidently. Goth is the OG. Goth is a musical and aesthetic movement built around some of the post-punk bands we talked about earlier, as well as some influence from industrial and metal. Goth gets its name from Gothic literature and horror, which romanticized death, tragedy, the old, the arcane, and the supernatural. Goth aesthetics followed in a similar vein. At its most flamboyant, goth fashion was a romantic reinterpretation of classic Victorian horror tropes like vampires, werewolves, and corpses. In terms of clothing, this often meant an abundance of lace, laces, leather, velvet, corsets, and long coats, often in a very dark color palette accompanied by black hair and black and white makeup. The origins of this fashion in popular culture can be seen in the album cover of Nico's 1968 album, The Marble Index, and later in 1976 with the debut of The Damned, whose lead singer dressed as a vampire in what might have been a play on his former job as an actual gravedigger. Over the 80s and 90s, the more extreme version of this fashion solidified into a more coherent and recognizable aesthetic. But at the same time, a more subdued and mundane version of the style developed. Not a lot of teenagers in 2003 were coming to school in corsets and top hats, but there was a popular goth-inspired style. I've seen this style labeled New Goth. Mostly this just meant an all-black wardrobe, often dyed black hair or heavy black makeup, and maybe some occult iconography. I think you can look at Evanescence for what an updated 2000s take on goth could look like. Some people would call them new goth, both as a musical genre and an aesthetic. There was also a fair bit of aesthetic overlap between new goth and metal, especially black metal, so it was not uncommon to see those incomprehensible black metal band logos plastered everywhere in goth fashion. I've seen emo described as a subcategory of goth. I don't think this is something that I agree with literally, but I think it points in the right direction. In many ways, emo was sort of goth light. It appropriated the obsession with dark color palettes, poorly dyed black hair, and a lot of eyeliner, but was a little more restrained, favoring skinny jeans and skate shoes over fishnets and boots. Unique to emo was the classic swept bangs emo haircut, which, I mean, you just had to have in 2007. You had a lot of black and white checkerboard patterns and band t-shirts. Emo fashion was also pretty androgynous. I mean, aspects of it definitely were gendered, but there was also a fair bit of crossover. A lot of the stuff wasn't really marketed to guys, so there was a lot of crossing the gender lines in the early scene. Like, before we had skinny jeans, they were just called girl jeans, and they were exclusively marketed to women. So, shout out to the young scene kings for eschewing traditional gender norms. There was also a streak of emo which was profoundly nerdy, perhaps tying in with emo's fixation on being outcast, misunderstood, and denigrated. I saw a lot of references to an image of emo that included thick glasses, poor social skills, and a love of poetry and literature. Culturally, too, emo was, in many ways, a toned-down goth. Emo kids might fetishize meditations on death, but not occult symbolism or storybook monsters. They might imagine themselves as poets, but not literal witches. Emo took the grand melancholy of abandoned cathedrals and morphed it down into this small sadness of suburban bedrooms. In many ways, I think scene was to emo what emo was to goth. Remember your SAT analogies? As far as I can tell, scene gets its name from the scene, as in the music scene, and was in many ways an appropriation of emo aesthetic by a slightly more mainstream culture. Don't get me wrong, scene was still alternative, but it was maybe just a little less dysfunctional. Scene took the aesthetic aspects of emo, the hair, the dress, and even some of the music, and livened it up. Scene kids added platinum and neon to their hair and clothes, and added more lively, upbeat genres like neon pop punk and metalcore to their musical influences. The solitary sadness of emo was replaced by a more social party atmosphere. The swept emo hair was taken to its extreme with huge puffs and bows. This was also the era when every single band had neon cartoon monster merch. On the more extreme side of scene, you had the brutal kid aesthetic. These were guys with snapbacks, gauges, and tank tops who listened to a lot of Suicide Silence and Whitechapel. On the other hand, you had the more pop scene kids who had the blonde swept emo hair and listened to like Breathe Carolina. Also, shout out to crunkcore, which was a tiny genre that didn't really feel relevant when I was talking about emo music, but was basically the hyperpop of the MySpace era, but bad, kind of. Big scene vibes. The one thing that I consistently read in posts from the time is that to be emo was to really care about emo music and art, while scene kids were just in it for the party scene. I think this may have been some heavy revisionism on the part of young emo kids who feared their culture was being appropriated by the careless masses, but I don't think this idea came from nowhere. I do imagine the prototypical scene kid to be less tribal about their music tastes and more open to just going to parties or festivals and enjoying whatever's playing. I've been speaking very concretely describing these aesthetics and subcultures, but of course, the reality was a lot more blurry. As much as these may have been the archetypes of the given subcultures, there were, of course, plenty of people who self-identified as one label, despite embodying some or all of the characteristics of another. More than that, though, I think there was almost no one who actually looked like these stereotypes in real life. As someone who actually lived through this era, I can honestly count on one hand the number of times I've ever actually seen someone with the full scene girl hair in the wild, and I don't think I've ever actually seen someone in real life with Alex Gaskarth 2008 hair. even the people in these photos probably didn't actually look like this 90% of the time. For most of them, they probably got that dressed up one time to take that photo and never did again. So for most of these images of emo and scene aesthetic, they were less the norm and more a kind of platonic ideal that real kids might take 1 or 2 points of inspiration from. So we've talked about the music and aesthetic of emo, but what was the culture? What did it mean to be emo? Emo did derive from the word emotional, as in emotional hardcore, and I think by the 2000s, a lot of people were just using those words synonymously. In the 2000s, it would have been pretty common for someone to say that you were being emo if you were just expressing emotion, especially as a man. This was often used derogatorily as the act of being emotional became intermeshed with the emo subculture, which was not highly regarded by the mainstream. There was also not so veiled shades of homophobia and toxic masculinity in that sentiment. It was pretty common to hear gay used in conjunction with emo as a dismissive slur in those days. On the flip side, within emo culture, negative emotions were often glorified. There were pervasive attitudes of self-pity, feeling outcast by society and misunderstood. In some corners of the culture, there was also a lot of misanthropy, the feeling that normal people were at best boring and at worst just evil. There were aspects of this extreme sadness that were an authentic expression of real anguish, but there was also a lot of kind of performative nonsense. I think it's easy to roll your eyes at the kind of extreme melodrama and self-pity that was basically a core tenet of emo culture. I mean, for one thing, these emo kids were mostly literal children. I can't find any kind of demographic surveys from the time, but I would be willing to guess that a meaningful majority, maybe up to like 80% of the people who were self-identifying as emo and personifying these aesthetics in like 2010 were still living with their parents. And they weren't just kids, they were overwhelmingly white, middle-class, suburban kids. By all material measures, they had it really good. But I think this kind of ennui is actually uniquely the disease of the privileged. If you were struggling for comfort and survival, or if you were beset by real injustice, you have a struggle. And that, while not a good thing, does to some extent give you purpose and meaning in life. More than that, if you're facing real adversity, you don't really have the luxury of focusing most of your energy on thinking about how sad you are. So it's understandable if you don't feel a lot of pity for the emo kids of 15 years ago, or if you were one and you want to hang your head in shame a little bit. I'm not trying to convince you that they actually had it really tough, but I do think there's something interesting at play here. Taking a really hard left turn, I want to talk for a brief moment about feminism, or more specifically, men's rights activism and anti-feminism. Whoa, hold on, me from the future. Did you get really nervous because you saw someone who looks like me about to talk about men's rights on YouTube? Don't worry, I don't think this should be anything too heinous. Feminists welcome here, unless you're like a TERF and then get fucked, I guess. When you hear men's rights activists talk, one of the points they try to make a lot is that women actually have it pretty good in our society. More specifically, they'll talk about how, historically, most gender divisions have been set up to put men in danger or under extreme burdens of labor to basically serve the material needs of women. They'll say things like, sure, all the kings and rulers have been men, but that's because being a ruler is a really dangerous and taxing job. You know who else are men? All the soldiers and coal miners and railroad workers who gave their lives to put you where you are today. Now, this is basically wrong for a lot of reasons, but I'm not even really going to get into it here because I think a feminist might respond, the issue isn't really material conditions, although, I mean, it is also that, so don't forget about that. But they might say the issue at hand isn't whether historically women's material needs have or haven't been adequately met, or whether they've had to shoulder a disproportionate burden of labor in order to meet them. The issue is that they have historically been robbed of all agency and power, so they never really got to decide if the current system we have is one they're okay with. Historically, and even today, there are a lot of women who would really like to do these difficult and demanding jobs and hold these positions of power that men are saying, nah, trust us, you don't want it. But they aren't allowed the autonomy to make those decisions, at least maybe not until very recently. Now, there's obviously a lot more to this story and to feminism in general that I very much don't have time to get into here and frankly aren't really qualified to talk about. Instead, I'd like to turn the focus back to the whole point of this video, emo kids. To be clear, I'm not saying that the oppression of the patriarchy is really in any way comparable in scope or severity to the trouble of 9th grade white kids in 2008. But I do think there's an analogous involuntary exchange of power for material wealth that is taking place. Suburban white kids in the 2000s experienced this unique ennui of having every one of their material necessities provided for, but being utterly powerless. Feeling like this privilege is foisted upon you without the opportunity to do anything to earn it, or more importantly, have any say in the nature of the arrangement. And when you're a kid in that state of mind, you really have nothing to do but sit around and feel bad about yourself and make these trivial but melodramatic transgressions. Stuff like listening to music your parents wouldn't like, or dyeing your hair, or getting tattoos or piercings. Actually, I think there's kind of an obsession in emo, and to some extent in a lot of youth counterculture movements for that matter, with the most fundamental autonomy, control over your own body. I think adolescence is a time when, for the first time in a lot of people's lives, they want to do things with their own body, whether that's be sexually active or get tattoos or do drugs, or increasingly now express their gender in different ways, and they're told no. They're robbed of that autonomy. A lot of aspects of emo aesthetic and culture can really be seen as performative assertions of bodily autonomy. Like maybe your parents wouldn't let you get a piercing, but they would let you dye your hair, so you took what you could get as a way to kind of stake your claim on that part of your physicality. Or maybe they wouldn't let you dye your hair, so you bought those clip-in hair extensions from Hot Topic and put them in on the bus before school. It was kind of like trench warfare over your own body. Your parents drew the line at some given point, and you sure as hell weren't going to cede any ground, so you planted your flag right at the very edge of your domain, or even made these small offensive forays or covert missions into enemy territory. Maybe they wouldn't let you get a punk haircut, but you could get away with just not cutting your hair for a little while and growing out those emo bangs. Or you couldn't drink alcohol, but you could buy energy drinks on your school lunch break, so you just kind of LARPed with those. A lot of emo culture was really all about these kinds of tiny acts of rebellion that were utterly anemic, but also kind of really all these kids could muster. When I was researching this essay, I came across a lot of mentions of a sort of performative bisexuality in emo culture. I saw a lot of references to emo boys kissing other emo boys, not because they were attracted to each other, but because it was just part of the aesthetic. Now, this is never something that I was aware of at the time, and in retrospect, I do kind of question the extent to which these boys were really disinterested in each other and weren't just kind of hiding behind a closet door of performative irony. But this is consistent with a reading of emo as an assertion and affirmation of bodily autonomy. Also, I mean, I really don't want to make too much of this feminism analogy, but the comparison kind of writes itself. Also, if we're talking about bodily autonomy, we really have to talk about self-harm, suicidality, and the psychopathology of emo culture. When you have control over literally nothing else in your life, often the only thing people feel like they do have control over is harming their own body. A lot of what I said about asserting autonomy could really be said to some extent of any youth counterculture movement, from grunge to punk to goth and scene. Although I do think it is particularly prominent in emo since the demography skewed so young and suburban. But one aspect that was really unique to emo, almost to the point of being a defining pillar, was the fetishization of self-harm. References to self-harm and suicide, as well as just the extreme depression that can lead someone to those acts, were absolutely pervasive, not just in the music and lyrics, but in the culture too. Now, this is a bit of a nuanced issue because it definitely wasn't universal. There were a lot of kids for whom the fixation on self-harm and suicide was totally tangential. They maybe weren't put off by it, but it also wasn't a draw to them. They came to the scene for other reasons, and there were a lot of other legitimate reasons to get into emo. Especially in the later years, we did also see a lot of people in the scene trying to get away from that stuff and to discuss it in a slightly more helpful way. On the other hand, I think there were a lot of people for whom the aesthetic of pain was very appealing. I think aesthetics of suffering are kind of more pervasive in our culture than we tend to think. I've experienced this a lot in the world of competitive academia, where there's often a kind of one-upmanship in terms of how difficult people's workloads are. Like, oh, I have to read 300 pages by Friday. Oh, you only have to read 300 pages? I have to read like 500, plus I have to write 10,000 words on it. Guess I'm not sleeping this week. Oh, you have all week to do that? I have to watch 6 hours worth of film and write an analysis on it, and it's due in 4 hours. Lol. I think there's a similar kind of thing at play in the kind of rise and grind hustler entrepreneur culture that's come up in the last few years. A lot of people are kind of braggadocious about the amount of suffering they put themselves through to get where they are today. It's also present in sports and fitness culture. Really, it's everywhere once you start looking for it. I think this is almost always unhealthy, but it was especially notable in the emo scene because there was such an emphasis on emotional pain and physical self-abuse. You saw a lot of like Tumblr mood boards with sepia vignetted pictures of someone's cut forearms and a romantic caption. This was pretty gross and obviously led to a lot of people getting hurt. But in a way, there was also a positive side to it, because the third group of people who this culture appealed to were people who were legitimately dealing with a lot of serious mental pathology. In many ways, the online emo world became a support group to them. I'm not going to try and speculate about whether or not emo was a net benefit for the psychological health of its constituents. There were undoubtedly a non-zero number of kids who committed suicide in the 2000s who would not have done so if they hadn't gotten the idea from the emotional media they consumed. Although I do think this number was much lower than what news hysteria at the time painted it to be. I don't really believe that any media has the power to turn an otherwise healthy and well-functioning person suicidal. At the same time, there were undeniably thousands of young kids who were already dealing with a lot of mental trauma in their lives and gravitated to the scene because it helped them. These kids felt seen, understood, and validated by the community that formed both online and in person around this stuff. Despite all the ways that we might criticize emo music and fandom for not always having the healthiest attitudes on mental health, it without doubt helped an innumerable number of people in very concrete ways. Now, today, we have the understanding to realize how bad of an idea it probably is to expose a lot of extremely depressed young people to glorifying iconography of self-harm and suicide. That's not, generally speaking, productive. But it's easy to forget how recently we've started to normalize mental illness and mental health care. Back in the beginning of the 2000s, therapy and prescription psychotropic drugs were only something for basically insane people. People mostly just weren't really thinking about mental health, and when they were, it was in an extremely negative light. Emo culture, despite undeniably doing harm to a lot of those people, also was kind of a transition in our cultural understanding of mental health. In a lot of ways, I think it opened the door and served as a bridge between the past, where mental health was totally ignored, and the present, where we're starting to be able to deal with it in more compassionate and productive ways. And in the period in the middle, we routinely talked about it in a way that we might see as problematic now, but it was still the beginnings of opening that doorway. So, with all that being said, what was emo? Well, it was kind of a music genre, but kind of not. I mean, it was a genre, but it was also a kind of general attitude towards a broad supercategory of music. It was a dark, moody aesthetic that was very, very poorly defined. It was a cultural movement that both advocated for safe emotional expression and fetishized self-harm. It was mostly a lot of incessant whining from the extremely privileged, but was also a bold affirmation of autonomy by the powerless. And I don't know, I think it was pretty cool. Wait, whoa, hold on, that was such a good ending, but there's still more to talk about. What happened next? What's the legacy? Is emo dead? Oh, I guess not. Emo is definitely on an upswing again. Sometime around 2010 to 2014, it seems like almost everyone who was involved with the 2000s mall emo scene collectively came to their senses or just kind of grew out of it and was suddenly really embarrassed by their emo phase. This part of history got buried in shame for about 10 years, Now, in the 2020s, most of those people are in their 20s and 30s and are mostly over their embarrassment and are starting to re-embrace emo in a nostalgic capacity. We are starting to see a resurgence of the musical genres that built emo, and a bit of the culture and aesthetic is coming with it. We are also starting to see a new generation coming of age who grew up in an era after emo and are embracing the genre as a retro aesthetic. You remember those two emo kids I showed at the beginning? Both those pictures were taken the month I was recording this and were posted to Tumblr by young people with the hashtag 2000s aesthetic. You have a really talented young artist like Olivia Rodrigo, who is clearly biting a lot of Paramore style, but she was 4 years old when Misery Business came out. Teenagers today are listening to Paramore and Bring Me the Horizon the same way kids in the 2000s were listening to Led Zeppelin. You're seeing a lot of TikToks of young teenagers showing off emo aesthetics who literally weren't born yet when From Under the Cork Tree came out. The one difference that I see between original emo and the revival scene is a thin veneer of irony. The original emo scene was painfully, unflinchingly sincere, which I think is part of what made it so embarrassing as soon as it was no longer cool. Kids today, though, are a lot more self-aware, as is everyone who has the benefit of having gone through this once already. So there's a lot more self-reflection and meta humor in the scene today. The truth, though, is that even though pop punk and metalcore and even post-hardcore are making a comeback, those genres haven't really been the music of emo for a long time. A lot of people say that punk isn't a genre or a style, it's an ethos. I think the same could be said about emo. In the 20-teens, as the old form of emo was dying, the essence of emo polymorphed into other genres. Mostly this was hip-hop derived genres like trap metal and emo rap. This scene has been growing and coalescing for a while now. On the more experimental, aggressive side, you have artists like Ghostmane, Scarlord, and Death Grips.
But if you ask for more, bullshit, matador, grab the floor, rip it, grab to a board, you ramble while I check my phone.
Then you have the more melodic mumble rappers like Juice WRLD, Lil Peep,
Nothing like them other motherfuckers. I could make you rich, make you right, I could make you this, baby, I could make you that.
Suicide Boys, and Poya.
Yeah, I don't need nobody help, but I feel like I'm dying. Begging for someone to pick me up and keep me thriving.
All doing some version of emo rap or sad trap. You also have the more pop punk adjacent artists like Nothing Nowhere, Convulk, and 39 Feet of Smoke who are doing some kind of crossover. The really sad, performatively depressed kids that would have been listening to The Used if this was 2005 aren't listening to the pop punk revival bands. They're listening to Juice WRLD. Emo rap was just really coming into its own as a genre in the late 2010s, but it lost two of its biggest stars when Lil Peep and Juice WRLD both passed away in 2017 and 2019 respectively. They both released hugely successful posthumous albums, but it feels like losing two of the most iconic figures of the scene kind of took the wind out of the sails of the movement, at least in the mainstream. There are still a lot of talented artists making this stuff though, and it'll be interesting to see what traction they're able to get going forward. So I'm excited about the emo revival. I'm selfishly looking forward to seeing a bunch of the music and aesthetics that I like out and about in the world again. And I'd really like to see emo rap survive. I think there's still a lot to explore in that genre. The truth is, though, that even if these both turn out to be very successful cultural movements, they probably won't last more than a few years. These things rarely do. But teenage angst will be around forever, and it's inevitable that that energy will be reincarnated in another genre of music and another subculture down the line, ad infinitum, or at least until the end of capitalism. And I don't know, I think that's pretty cool. Wait, I said that already.